welcome back to My Own Worst Enemy. It is time to start another playthrough, and this time it's going to be C.S.A. America's Civil War, 1861 to 1865. This is from Ben Madison and Wes Ernie. This is Counter-Strike minigame number 16 from Fiery Dragon. So this game is no longer in print. You can only find it on the used markets if you're lucky, and then you're probably going to pay probably more than you want to for this. I can't remember. I bought this a few years back, so it wasn't as bad, I don't think, as it probably is now. And I'm hoping, really kind of hoping, that this game gets the Death in the Trenches treatment at some point. In other words, I'm hoping that maybe Ben and Wes can have this thing reprinted and maybe updated, because it looks like a really interesting, neat little take on the Civil War. And we're going to play, I don't know that we'll play the entire game. Maybe we will, who knows, but certainly, if nothing else, a turn or two to see what this game is all about. I've been in the Civil War mood lately. Currently, I'm reading the Cunning Fury. It's part of Bruce Catton's trilogy on the Civil War, and it's really interesting. I haven't read it before. I do have some other Catton books, but I have not read this particular trilogy, and it's really good so far. I'm probably a little more than halfway through the first book in that series, the Cunning Fury, as I mentioned. So, yeah, in a Civil War mood, so I thought, I've had this one for a while. I did an unboxing on this, and I'll leave a link below to that unboxing. And it was not a used copy, so I did end up punching this out and clipping the corners on these. Now, these counters, let's see if I can grab one. They're not the best in the world. They had these little side nibs that I couldn't quite get off all of them, but they did clip pretty nice, so they don't look too bad. Like I said, maybe we'll see an update to this game at some point. That would be really, really great. So what I thought I would do is, this will just be an introduction and kind of a what's going on type video. So I've got the rule book here, and I will go through the rule book because it's in sequence of play, and as things come in, just kind of walk through it real quick and give you an overview of how the game works and how it should work, and the rules, and what we are going to be looking to do in the coming turn or two or three or however many we end up doing. And I will go ahead and make a note now that if you do own this game, you're probably looking at this map and realizing that that's not quite the same map that you got with your game. No, 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 no. As typical with Ben Madison, Wes Ernie games, I didn't really care too much for the map that came with this game. And I'm going to show you. This is my own map that I created on my own. And basically what I did was, it's the original map, but I put a kind of an underlay, if you will, of an old period military map on this. Let me show you. This is the map that comes with the game. So take a look at that real quick. That's my map next to the game map that came with it. And let's take we'll zoom in here and I'll show you a little more detail of the map, and just, like I said, not a great bit of difference, but changed it just a little bit. All right, so we're zoomed in here, and you can see that my map is on the right-hand side. And like I said, all I did really was put this underlay map on the kind of the original map. So I did completely redo this map in, I forget which map program I used. So this all original drawing. I didn't just copy it and paste over anything. So I actually started from scratch and redid all the hexes and all the little numbers and everything on my map. But I just thought this looked a little less colorful than the map that came with the game, which is the one here on the left side. So that's why you are seeing a different sort of map. I didn't really want to use that map. And actually, like I said, I'm not 100% satisfied with my map either, but I think it is a little bit better than what came with the game. So we will be using that. And so let's zoom out now back to the overview. All right, back to the overview. And like I said, I'm just going to kind of go through we'll step through the rule book real quick. It's not a very big rule book. It's only 24 pages, but you can see it's not a full-size rule book. It's a little mini book that fits into the mini box that you can see over here from Fiery Dragon. So it's a rules light game, but there is a lot going on, which is typical, I think, with the Ben Madison, Wes Ernie game. So there's a lot of moving parts that we have to consider as we go through this. So I'll just kind of step through this. The sequence of play is its own card over here, and I've got it, pretty easy for me to look at here as we step through this. And this does a good job of guiding you exactly what you'll do in a turn. So we do have that to refer to. And so let's take a quick look at just what you're looking at here on the camera. So this is the sequence of play card, as I pointed out. There are two special event cards, one for the United States, one for the Confederate States. These are basically going to be options that a side can play during a turn. So for instance, The Confederates start with a rebel yell token. Now, they tell you in the rule book to use pennies to mark these things, but I'm going to use red for the Confederacy and blue for the Union, just to make it a little more easier for me to see and read on the map. So basically, though, these events are things that you can play. If you have a token on one of these events, you can play it, and it'll tell you in the text how you would play this. For instance, this one is the rebel yell, and basically it is telling you that the Confederates may designate a non-Grand Army stack and kind of treat it as if it were a Grand Army and move it that way. And we'll talk about Grand Armies as we go on here. So these are your special event cards. There is an optional rule for artillery supremacy, and that's on this card. There's also congressional control for the Confederates and the Union. There's places where veterans will go and available generals for either side. This is the turn record track. It starts turn 1, and there are 4 years, 5 years if you play with the optional rule. So we're up from 1861 to 1864 is normally where the game ends with the election of the President of the United States. But there is an option to continue on into 1865 should you choose to do so. This is the naval warfare map. So this is where the Confederates and the Union will place ships to try to impact inflation of either side, and we'll talk about that when we get to the inflation. And these are the omnibus markers track. So you have one for the Confederates, one for the Union, and here we'll be tracking inflation. We have this little inflation counter for each side. Up here we have the British and the French entry markers that we'll be tracking for the Confederates. Really, it's for both sides, but we're going to track them on the Confederate omnibus track there. And then also you're going to have, for every general on the map, you're going to have a corresponding general marker on this track that will tell you how many brigades the general has underneath him. So for these first two here, we have Butler and Lyon here, and they have only 1 brigade each. So that's what that's saying here. It's Fremont, and Rosecrans has 2. If you look on the map, there's Rosecrans. He's up here in Ohio. He has 2 brigades with him. And of course, McDowell is in DC. He has 7 brigades. So that's how we'll track that. Each side also will have one of these reserve markers, which is how you will increase your brigades on the map. So you will, if you want to assign more troops to, let's say, Rosecrans, we have 8 available, and I want to move 2 to him, so I would simply subtract 2 and add 2 to wherever Rosecrans is. And that's only done at a particular time in this sequence of play. So that's taken us around what these charts are around the map, and then of course the map itself, which I have showed you. Let's zoom back in for a second here. And yes, I am bringing back the zoom in mode for this game because the map is so small on the overview that it's kind of hard to see, so I'll probably do switching back like this several times. So basically, and there's a terrain effects card that came with the game that will explain what each of these different colored areas mean, and we'll get into those as we actually play the game. And then there are forts. So here's an example of a fort in Petersburg. It looks like has a fort. Forts will double defensive values of these units. There are presidential markers in the game. So there's Abraham Lincoln and there's Jeff Davis down there. And you can actually use those in battle if you want to, but this is, if you're familiar with the computer game Civilization, there's a mode in, I think it was Civ 3 called Regicide, and basically if you lost your king, you lost the game. And the same case here is if you lose one of your presidents, then you're going to lose. So it's kind of neat they're in the game, but I don't think there's a whole lot you're going to want to do with those. So there are presidents. Here's some of the armies we had talked about. So these are the generals, and this is what you'll be moving on the map. The map itself, and we'll get into this as we play, but you'll note there are borders. So these black borders, a unit cannot pass across a black border. So it kind of forces movement the way maybe historically that these units had to move at this time period. The red borders are state borders. So you can see that there are states designated on the map and also an area of the map. So like this is considered the Northeast, which will come into play. There are 5 states that make up that part, and certain rules will come into effect depending on what happens in the Northeast, whether the Confederates are invading up there or the cities are changing hands or whatever. So just a quick, I'll move us across here without doing a transfer. We'll just move the camera over to this side of the map to kind of give you an example of what's going on over here. More forts you see. The blue, these are considered river hexes, so there are special rules that will come into play for river hexes. We have the west over here with the Indian Territory, and that's marked with a different color. There's also on the map, I will bring down the camera here just quickly to show you that there are 4 hexes on this map that have V's in them. Now this is called the Vexed Mississippi mark, I guess you would call it. And basically, if the Union takes these 4 cities, the Confederacy becomes split, and then that entails some other things that happen. So let's zoom back out again and back to the overview. So that's just kind of a real quick look at what we're seeing on camera. And now we will step through in a little more detail. We'll go through, like I said, I'll use the rule book here to just step through what we're looking at. So first thing we encounter are random events. So this game, and this is kind of a Ben Madison Western thing with these, and this is like Death in the Trenches and Absolute Victory have something similar to this, where we will be drawing random chits out of a cup, and based on what chit we draw, these random events will occur in this book. And it's by year. The first year has 6 chits that you can pull, and follow-on years will have 8. So we'll put those in the cup and pull them. So let's say we would draw a random chit. Let's say we draw chit 3. We would have to do everything that is on this random events table if we pull chit 3. So we'll step through that, and this kind of explains what you would do or how you do those things in the random events. They kind of tell you on the chart, between the chart and the book, it's going to tell you exactly what you need to do in that order. And so the next thing we will have are generals and logistics. So let's talk about generals. We already did a little bit. I'm just going to grab a general marker. Let's see, here's Lee. And so there's General Lee. You can see his marker. Now you can see there are 3 numbers at the top, and there are some stars on the right-hand side. Those 3 numbers are the general's attack rating, his defense rating, and his initiative. So again, looking at Lee, that last number is initiative. So you can see there it's a 5. So basically for Lee to move, you'll have to roll to activate him, and on a 5 or less, then you would actually be able to take an action with General Lee. And so generals without brigades, so you can have generals on the map without brigades, and they can still move and fight. They cannot be killed that way. So the book makes a point of telling you that one of the strategies that you can use actually is delaying forces by moving around generals that do not have brigades. So we need to keep that in mind. Generals with brigades, we talked about how a general on the map has a corresponding marker over here that will tell you how many brigades the general has, and a general can have up to 20 brigades under his command. That's the limit. And it tells us that a brigade is about 3,000 to 5,000 men. Stacking, there's no stacking limits on the map. The only stacking that you have to worry about is the one I just said, and that's having no more than 20 brigades under a general. New generals are created through events, so either through the chit pull that we just discussed, generals will become available, and they will go on to the general available sheet, and we'll be able to bring those into play as need be, or as we can. And then it talks about there's an emergency assignment, so during a phase, instead of taking a move action, you can actually instead take a general from reserves and put him on the board. There's this concept of grand armies, and so the U.S. has 3 grand army markers. There's 2, and I'll grab the Army of the Potomac here. So there's 2 on the turn track already. So it's the Army of the Potomac for the Union, and then the Army of Northern Virginia for the Confederates that will come into being on the second turn. So we'll have access to those units. And they give you some special abilities beyond normally what a general with brigades can do. You can combine units. They're a little bit stronger. Certain grand armies are limited to certain areas on the map. So for the Army of the Potomac, they're going to be limited to this northeast region that we talked about. And that can change throughout the course of the game. I think there's some random events or certain things will trigger where it will free up those armies to move around outside of those areas. So you have to be careful about that. That's what I mean by there's a lot of little bits in these games that you have to kind of either keep track of in the back of your mind or double check in the rules as you're going through. Now there are veterans and cavalry units in this game. So veteran units are special units that act kind of like generals, but they do not have initiative. They'll have fortitude. And let's see if I can just grab a I think this is probably a, here's Mosby. I think he's considered a veteran unit, or maybe that's a guerrilla. Maybe that's not a veteran unit. We'll see those as they come out, though. There are, like I said, cavalry units. I'll grab one of those real quick. So this is, who is this? Morgan. So we will have cavalry units running around on the map, and they behave a little bit differently, and that's what they're telling us here. That and the cavalry, of course, has retreat, so they have the option to retreat before a battle. They also are unreliable, so that when you have a cavalry unit in an army stack, it may not participate in the battle. It may make its own mind up or its own decision, or something may have happened to it where it's not around. So we have to remember that. There is something called cavalry reconnaissance. Now, normally I'm going to play this solo, but if this is a two-player game, and normally these omnibus tracker markers would be hidden from each side. And so the cavalry you can use to run up to a stack and kind of see what's in that stack, where you want to know what Rosecrans has. You get a cavalry unit next to it, and then the player has to tell you, okay, well, Rosecrans actually has 8 brigades under him. But we're not going to worry about that here. Maybe I'll come up with some special solo rule to give us an advantage if we are able to get cavalry up next to unit. I don't know, maybe not. And then we go right into the pulses. So this is the actual meat of the game, where you're going to be moving your units on the map. And as I said, there's initiative, so a general is going to have to, before he can move, he's going to have to roll for initiative. So he gives the example here. McClellan has an initiative rating of 2. Surprise, surprise for McClellan. So, to move him, you must roll a 1 or a 2. So if you roll a 4, McClellan's not going to move. He gets marked as being used, and he's done for the turn. There are some exceptions to this rule, and it tells you here a Union River War. So if a Union general is in a river hex, he does not have to roll for initiative to move. He automatically gets to move. Also, interior lines, any general who starts the pulse not adjacent to the enemy and intends to end in a friendly controlled hex doesn't have to roll for initiative. So there are some things, again, we have to watch for with movement. There are some only hexes on the map, and they're signified by these dotted hex borders. So there's 2 here. It's kind of hard to see, I know, on the map, but there's a Confederate only and a Union only hex here on this side of the map. So that's what they're saying there. It talks about the Indians in the West. Now, there are Indian units in the game. We will see those. And there are let's see if I can grab the Texas Rangers. They are, for game purposes, considered Indian units, even though they're not really Indian units. So we will see those come into play. And then there's this thing called strategic redeployment, and then the reserve concept, which we've talked about. So if you're the Union, you can not only bring reinforcements from your omnibus track onto the map, but you can also go the other way. Your generals can send units back to the omnibus marker to be redeployed elsewhere later. The Confederates can't do that. They can only take their reserves from their omnibus to the map board. So they're not going to be able to transfer their troops around as easily as the Union. So that's kind of a bummer for them. And then we talked about the Northeast being up here. There's this Northeast Union invasion panic. So if Confederate troops get up into that area, do certain things, it's going to give we're going to have to give special consideration to the Union. They'll get to roll twice for activations and things like that. So that's what this is telling us. This Mississippi Unvexed, we've touched on. There are 4 cities. And once all 4 of those are USA controlled, the Mississippi is considered unvexed and the Confederacy is divided. And it says all USA units on river hexes must retreat at once or be destroyed. And the C.S.A. may no longer enter river hexes, so bad things happen if the Confederates lose control of the Mississippi. Again, surprise, surprise. Battles take place when units are in the same hex, and that will come about through the movement. And so now the way battles work, this is kind of interesting. Battle procedure is, we looked at, let's see if I can find Lee again. So here's Lee. And his numbers, again, it was offense, defense, and initiative here. Each brigade has a value of 113, so it's going to have a attack of 1, a defense of 1, and a thing called fortitude of 3. So fortitude is basically how much a unit can take, how much of a pounding it can take. And the way battles work, so Lee with his 785, and I'm going to go through the example here real quick, and maybe I'll throw up a graphic so we can look at this as I talk through it. And let's see. and I'm looking because, yeah, here's the Lee example. So it's telling us, so we saw Lee with his 7, 8, and 5. So it says General Lee has 17 brigades. So he's on the map. His omnibus marker shows him having 17 brigades. So Lee's value, and remember, a brigade is 113 is the attack, the defense, and the fortitude of that unit. So if you have 17 units, 17 times 1 is 17 for his attack. 17 times 1 is 17 for his defense. And then 17 times 3 is 51 for his fortitude. So that's just the brigades numbers, if you will. So you have 17, 17, 51 because there were 17 brigades. To that number, you'll add Lee's numbers, except for that final number, which in Lee's case is initiative, so it's not fortitude. So if we add Lee's 7 to that 17, that's going to give the entire stack an offensive rating of 24. We add the 8 to the 17, that's going to give 25 to the defense rating of that stack. And then 51 is going to still be the fortitude because Lee has no fortitude, he has initiative. So the final strength of that stack of 17 brigades under Lee would be 24, 25, 21. So now it's going to, so the attack value, 24 is his attack value. So you're going to choose a minimum of 1d6. You have to choose 1d6 up to as many as you want. So what you're trying to do is roll equal to or under that attack value. So in this case, I would want to roll a 24 would be a perfect attack. But, in order to get 24, I'm going to have to roll 4d6s. So, and in this case, I probably would want to do that because I can't really go over 24. And I could choose to roll 7d6s and gamble and try to get as high as I can without going over. So again, remember, it's a roll equal to or under thing here. So if you go over, if I rolled 7d6s and rolled higher than a 24, it's a miss. So that it'd be a complete miss for Lee. And then the other side's trying to do the same thing. So again, they're going to be calculating their attack value and rolling a number of d6s, trying to get equal to or under that number. So both sides will be doing that. And so we'll go through this example in the book where it talks about Edmund Kirby Smith. So it says Edmund Kirby Smith has 6 brigades. So 6, remember, the offensive firepower is going to be 6, the defensive is going to be 6, and then 6 times that 3 is going to be 18. So it says adding Kirby's own offensive firepower. So remember, 6 brigades times 1 is 6. Kirby's rating, his offensive firepower is 4. So you add that 4 to the 6 to get an attack strength of 10. And so in this case, the Confederate player is going to choose to roll 3d6. So he's trying to roll 10 or less because he wants to do as much damage as he can without rolling higher than that 10. So he announces he's rolling 3 dice, rolls his 3 dice, and he rolls a 3, a 2, and a 4. So he gets a combined total of 9. Well, that's a really good roll for this attack because he's only 1 under 10. So that's going to be 9 points against the enemy general. So 9 hits. And then, the enemy general is going to be doing the exact same thing. So that's the way combat is going to work. And then every time there's combat, the book here is telling us there's rough terrain and rivers. So you're going to have terrain modifiers will come into effect, doubling defensive values and things like that. The battle results, basically, it's who inflicts the most hits is going to win. There's going to be some retreating, some routing going on. We'll see that as we play. And then after every battle, generals have to roll for being killed. So it's possible that you could lose a general in a battle. And this happens every time there is a battle. You'll do this roll. And for the Union, it's if they roll double 6s, then the general dies. He is removed from the game. If it's the Confederates, if you roll snake eyes or double 6s, then the Confederate general will be eliminated from the game. So that's pretty brutal. And then there's this victory promotion thing, which is they're telling us that if a stack wins a battle, then if you have an available veteran brigade, then you can bring that out and add it to the stack. And it's telling us that if you conquer an unoccupied enemy city or liberate one of your own cities, that's also counted as kind of a victory. And Cunning. So Cunning, and if we look at Lee again, I think I mentioned this. Lee has 4 stars. That's his Cunning value. And so the way that works is in a battle, you're going to add up Cunning values for both sides, and whoever has more of these stars will win a tactical advantage. And so basically what that means is after you've calculated your attack and your defense values, here Lee has more cunning. So let's say Lee rolled an 18, which wasn't so good for Lee. He wanted to roll more. Well, then he can choose to roll an extra d6 and add the value to whatever the result was. So that's going to be useful. They also can use it to, I think, subtract from, let me take a quick look here. I think they can also subtract from the enemy side with their cunning value. And so, yeah, or you can subtract the results from the enemy's hit total. So you can actually use it to bring down the other sides with that cunning value. The other thing that the cunning on the general does, if you want to form one of these grand armies, you have to have a general with a cunning, one of these cunning stars, and they go from 1 to 4. So if you have to have a cunning general in a grand army. So we also have to keep that in mind. All right, and then we get into some special rules, forts and minefields. So forts are on the map already, and basically they're going to double the defensive value of the unit that's in them. There's this minefield counter where, and this would probably be another thing where 2 players is going to make more of a difference. You would have a minefield under one of the Confederate counters, and then the USA, when they enter the minefield, would have to roll and inflict casualties based on that. And then we have, this is, if you're familiar with the Civil War at all, you'll find this as amusing as I do. General McClellan has his own special rules here, and basically it's stating that if McClellan is on the map, and he does come out in turn 2 there, he must be stacked with the Army of the Potomac counter. He may never be moved more than 3 hexes away from Washington, D.C., as the crow flies. At the end of each USA logistics phase, he must always have more brigades assigned to him than any other U.S. general. He may not use the strategic reserve rule that we talked about, moving generals back and forth to the reserve. But he may make a special instantaneous move between Washington, D.C. and any coastal hex north of the Chesapeake Bay line. So I think that's this white line that's up here. He doesn't roll for initiative when making that special move. And let's see what else. In addition, units stacked with McClellan trace their attack supply from the fort marker. We haven't talked about supply, but we will. And as if McClellan is in Fort Monroe, that says that the C.S.A. may not enter or attack Washington. And this changes after 1862. So like I said, there are things that will change some of these rules and special rules as the game progresses, as the years go on, or a special event may override some of these things. There's this thing called geographical generals. So special generals like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, they were proud Virginians who wanted to defend Virginia, so they would never be able to move more than 6 hexes away from Richmond as the crow flies. So they're going to stay in this area. And then same thing for the Union. You have Grant and Sherman, who may not enter the Northeast or Virginia until the Mississippi is unvexed. In other words, the Confederacy is split. And then we get to supply. So what is supply? Basically, each unit on the board must be able to trace a supply route back to 2 different friendly supply sources. And friendly supply sources in game terms are these cities. And you can see these red squares are major cities. The smaller red circles are minor cities. The Union has the blue. The greens will be neutral until they flip, and we'll mark those with a flag. Out of supply effects, basically at the end of a pulse, if you're out of supply, then the brigades will be considered destroyed, and veterans and cavalry will have to go back to disabled, and generals will have to roll for leader death. So bad things happen if you're out of supply. And then there's these high mountains, and that's these triangle hexes, where these are special terrains which prevents the supply of large armies, and we'll have to look out for that as we move around. Naval warfare. So I'm going to have to do this a little bit differently. This is another thing where we have the naval warfare map, and basically each side in secret is going to write down what available ships are going where on this map card, or they can choose shore duty. Shore protection, it's called, and the Confederates can place ships in ports, and the Union can try to attack those ports if they desire. The way I'm going to have to do it, though, I think probably what I'm going to do is pick where I want Union ships to go, and then roll randomly for where the Confederate ships will go. And what the effect is here is inflation. And there will be combat. If ships are in the same area, there can be combat. But aside from that, if a Confederate ship lands somewhere where there's not a Union ship, then inflation will rise for the USA. And that's a bad thing. So you want to keep inflation low for both sides, because if inflation gets out of control, if you get up to 70 on either omnibus marker, your economy collapses and you surrender. You must lose the game. So there can be landings, amphibious landings, and it's saying here that the U.S. can only do these landings when a landing marker becomes available. And the Union will be limited to, there's a white line at the bottom of the map here and one here, and the Union's limited to landing inside those boundaries. Moving right along, inland penetration. So this is after the U.S. lands. They can put a supply marker in, and it just kind of gives them supplies, all that's saying. Emancipation. So after the U.S. wins a battle during a turn, they can issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and this will have an effect in the game. You'll roll a die, and on a 6, there's a slave insurrection. That'll have some impact on the game. Or it will also affect the standing of the British and the French entry. Now, we haven't talked about the entry for the British and the French. Their markers are up here, and if they ever get to 20, that's when they intervene. Inflation. So this is what I was talking about as far as inflation marker. And like I said, if you get to $70, then your economy will collapse. So you want to keep your inflation down. This is telling us that basically the way that inflation will change is through random events or taking or losing cities on the map. And of course, it's a lot worse if you lose a major city versus a minor city. And it tells us that here for the C.S.A. what those numbers are if they lose a city, or what the USA happens if they lose a city in that economic collapse, which I talked about. Politics and victory. So we talked about the presidents, and this tells us how you move those presidents. And it says here also at the end of every turn, if a player's president is not in his capital, increase the inflation box by 1. So you're kind of encouraged to keep the presidents at home there. So that's probably a good idea. There are some elections that will come about, and the turn record track has on here when these elections take place. Those are congressional and presidential. And this will tell us how we will conduct those elections. Depending on who's in control of Congress, good or bad things can happen to a side, and that's what it's telling us here. And then, of course, there's the U.S. presidential election of 1864, and this is where the game will end if we get that far. If Lincoln is reelected, basically we're going to win the game. If McClellan gets elected, we're going to lose the game. And that, like I said, that doesn't happen until the fall of 1864. Border states and territories, we've talked about a little bit. So we do have the Indian Territory over here. There are border states, Missouri and Kentucky. Now they do start in neutral, and you can tell that because they are green on the map to start, Kentucky and Missouri. And it says Missouri begins the game neutral. It can be invaded by both players. When one player first has his own flag markers on all 4 Missouri cities simultaneously, Missouri becomes part of that player's home country. And then for Kentucky, it's telling us that if a player moves his units into neutral Kentucky, he has invaded Kentucky. And then, of course, Kentucky will flip. There's also let's see if the sequence of play card, there's I think there is a role for Kentucky on the sequence of play cards. What it's telling us here, let's see. In the Kentucky phase, you roll a die, and that will determine which side Kentucky will go for. So we'll keep that in mind as we go along. And then it tells us the Indian Territories, or modern Oklahoma in parentheses, was a dusty, sparsely settled no man's land, which several Indian tribes had been dumped after their removal from colonized American lands. It has no effective government and starts off neutral. Both players may freely invade it. Its Indian villages are considered minor cities and are counted as owned by their respective players at the start of the game for inflation purposes. So, and then for intervention, we've talked about, and basically, and there's some other additional rules here talking about these entry markers. So again, you have British and French entry markers here that will rise according to certain events. And if they ever get to 20, then that side's going to intervene. And there are actually I'll grab a couple here. There are actually armies that the French and the Brits can actually get into the game if it comes to that, and it could happen. That's one of the things I like about this game is you're not on a historical railroad here, so anything is possible. I mean, there are things in place that kind of keep you on the historical track, but it's not going to necessarily turn out exactly like the Civil War we all know. And so this tells us, like I said, 20, and also there's some other things on here that will affect these entry markers. And it says add +1 to British entry for each USA landing attempted. Add +10 to British and French whenever the C.S.A. wins a battle in the Northeast. So if the Confederates get up here and win a battle in the Northeast, that's going to be a good thing for the Confederates, and it's going to push those entry markers higher. In this case, 10, which is halfway there. Reinforcements and paroles. So this is based on where, and then when we go into the logistics phases where this will happen, based on where your inflation marker ends up, it will tell you what your reinforcements are for the turn, and that's going to adjust your reserve markers based on that. Paroles, it's a random events. It looks like it's a random events thing. There are prisons on the map. So there's Andersonville, and then there's a prison up in, where is that? Illinois. And if units of the opposing sides enter those prisons, then certain things will take place, and we'll encounter that if we get there. Game setup. The game is now set up as per the instructions. The game does come with, you'll get a setup card for the Union and the Confederates, and that tells you exactly where to put those markers. The book also has some additional information on what gets set up. Optional rules. So now there are optional rules in the game. It is my intent to use every optional rule in the book, except for 2 for sure I'm not going to use. One is I'm not going to go to 1865. I'm not going to extend it. And that's assuming I even get to 1865 anyway. I don't know. Like I said, I may not play the entire game. I may just do a few turns. So we're going to use guerrillas and massacres. Cavalry raids we'll use. This evacuation movement, reaction movement, bummers we'll use, I think. Basically, yeah. So all the prisons, we're going to use all these things. And except for the extension I talked about, and this Beauregard prevails. So this has the potential of destroying the game, it says, if you pull this in the very first turn. So we're not gonna fool with that. And then the only other thing that I may kind of ignore is there's this optional on to Richmond Southern Manhood rule. And basically on the turn track, there's this little @R symbol, and so that's what this is referring to. And what it's telling you is any turn marked with that, then the USA must launch an attack in Virginia towards Richmond or another major city in Virginia. So it's kind of forcing you to go on the attack. And on the other hand, the Southern Manhood says that the C.S.A. must make at least one attack somewhere on the map every single turn. If you don't, then you lose the game. I'll try to do this. I'm not going to really hold this optional rule that strictly, I don't think, because I understand what they're trying to do here, but I think it's maybe a little for playing the game purposes and showing the gameplay. I don't think I'm going to enforce that quite as much. I'll try maybe to keep it going, but if I can't, I don't think it's a big deal. And bad winter and artillery superiority, that's on this track here. We'll use that, and that's going to add some bonuses to a side based on who has artillery superiority. So that's it. Basically, I think I've touched upon everything. Now there is another optional rule, and that is the this combat modes chart. And basically, again, this is more for like a 2-player game where a defender will choose his defense, an attacker will choose his attack, and it'll have special calculations based on what you've chosen there. I'm not going to really use that. And the only other thing that I need to mention, I believe, is I printed out, this is from Board Game Geek. There was some errata. I think this was Board Game Geek, could have been Consim World, I can't remember, but there's some Q&A and some errata that I'm just going to try to keep in the back of my mind while we play through this. I have counters off to the side here and off to the side over here. These are control markers. These are our event markers we'll pull from the Chit Cup. And the other thing is, as we take actions, we are going to, well, let's see. I'm going to bring out, the game tells you that, let's say that brag here takes an action. When you take an action with brag, it tells you to flip it upside down to show that brag has moved. We're not going to do that. I'm going to put down these little tokens. So once they complete an action, just going to cover them with that so that I know that they have moved. And I think that'll save me a lot of housekeeping when it comes to flipping units around and all that kind of stuff. But you'll see that as I play along. All right, I think that is it. We'll take a quick look again at the board. Again, so this is the game set up as it should be for turn number 1. Turn marker is here in turn number 1. We begin in June, July of 1861. Now, there is this thing called drafts. You can have drafts, and that is a choice that the player can make to decide whether or not to do that. And if you do a draft, you'll get some more reinforcements, but again, it's going to impact your inflation, so use with care. That is it. I think I have covered just about everything. I just wanted to do a quick overview and introduction to what we're looking at here. When we come back, I will play through at least one turn, and we will see how the game plays. And again, I don't know how far I will get into this game. I don't know if we'll play a whole game or not. I've got a lot. I've got a lot of games stacked up that I need to get to the table. I'm getting behind. I still want to do a live chat at some point. I keep saying that. I finally got a camera in, so I'm getting closer. It's just a matter now of me sitting down and spending some time setting up that camera and figuring out how to do a live stream on YouTube. So hopefully at some point we'll do a live stream and talk about things like whether you want to see me play games to completion or just a few turns or other stuff. So look for that at some point. We are going to end it here. Again, if you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't. Like the video because that always helps. And there is a Patreon that is up and running. If you really want to help me, that's the best way to do it at this point. That's it. I'll see you back here next time. As always, thank you for watching.